All right, that's strange fruit. What I'm going to talk about a little bit today is something you probably didn't know, at least not in the same context. And Abraham Lincoln, he too grew strange fruit, produced strange fruit. And today is the 157th anniversary of the execution, the largest, the mass execution in the history of the United States. An execution whose order was signed by Abraham Lincoln and would take place the day after Christmas in 1862. That's in Mankato, Minnesota. If you ever hear the expression, the Dakota 38, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the 38 men, human beings. Although it wasn't lynching in the same way that we think of lynching, it certainly was a lynching. It was 38 human beings hung in a massive gallows to a crowd of over 4,000 people. The good people of Mankato, Minnesota came out to celebrate the execution of 38 human beings the day after Christmas. So there were over 300, almost 400, almost 390, almost 400 Dakota who were convinced to surrender on the promise that they would be treated fairly in what has been come to be known as either the U.S. Dakota Wars or War of 1862. It was also called the Sioux Uprising or the Dakota Uprising, and I'll get into exactly why that conflict arose in the first place. So there was almost 400 Dakota that were tried, and what were they tried for? They were tried for attacking or defending, depending on how you want to look at it, themselves against just under 500 armed white settlers. Armed white settlers. Now, how were these white settlers in Dakota Territory in the first place? Well, I'll get into that a little bit later too. But that's called the Homestead Act, signed earlier that same year. Something that had been worked on since before Abraham Lincoln. This was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, but it was vetoed by Buchanan, and it was all tied to slavery and some of that other stuff. So you had this trial that took place, and the trial would take just about a month. Most of the almost 400, 390 Dakota that would be tried, it would be done in less than a month. The vast majority of them got tried in a week. So out of that trial, 319 were convicted. Out of the 319, 303 were sentenced to death, while 16 were to die in prison. They were going to spend their lives in prison. Like I said, most were tried in less than a week. The evidence was sparse, supplied by a relatively few individuals who just named people. Identities were obscured, at best. The court was biased. It wasn't really a court. It wasn't a court of law. It was set up as a military tribunal. A tribunal put together by the military commission. The defendants had no legal representation, and most of them didn't even speak English. They were just led into a room, in and out. Like I said, over 400, almost 400 were tried in less than a month. The vast majority of them were tried in less than a week. 303 were sentenced to death. Now, this system didn't really have any legal foundation. The whole idea of creating this, this kind of court, I mean, it wasn't treating the defendants as military armed combatants, or as people who were a sovereign nation that the United States was at war at. They were treating them as if these were crimes, but they weren't being tried by a civilian court. So even the basic authorization of this court or this tribunal was suspect at best. Let me jump way ahead because one of the Supreme Court justices who most people are familiar with, Anthony Scalia, he once said, and I'll get the quote exactly right here. He said, when it comes to Indian law, most of the time we're just making it up. And it's not just about Indian law. It's about policy. It's about how to deal, from a judiciary standpoint. And this is a judge. So, when he says, when it comes to law, we're just making it up. As a judge, he's just making up what are the legal conditions to deal with Native people. So, and that's Anthony Scalia just a few years ago. So if they were just making it up during Anthony Scalia's time, and he said this as it related to, land issues, and that's what this conflict was over, land issues. So in the modern era, the Supreme Court justice is saying, we're just making it up. We don't know. We're just making it up as we go along. Well, they certainly were in 1862. So they created this sham of a court. When people want to talk about kangaroo courts, or witch hunts, they hung witches. And that's what they did with these guys. They hung them. So, but Lincoln realized, hanging 303? How's that going to look? I'm in the middle of the Civil War issues and all these other things going on. I can't be executing 300 Native people. So he said, I got a solution. We'll just execute the ones who violated women somehow. Problem is, whether any of them actually did, they only had 2 out of the 300, out of the almost 400 tried, they only had 2 that they charged with violating women. Well, that wasn't going to do. We can't just execute 2. So Lincoln said, well, let me create some other criterion that I can use to give the good people of Mankato, Minnesota their hanging, but at the same time, not make me look like some cruel bloodlust president to the rest of the world. So he whittled the number down. He included those 2. Then he came up with 39 names, and he just used the list that of the convicted. And how arbitrary, what the actual criteria was, it's not real clear. It could have been the frequency of their name showed up. But that's what Lincoln did. He took that number, whittled it down to 39, and the rest. No, they weren't. Their sentences weren't commuted in terms of freedom. No, the rest would just die in prison. They were all going to die as a result of these convictions. The question: were some going to die on a single day, or some just live in conditions that would give them an early death in prison? So, in the interest of trying to look good, Lincoln signs the execution order. These guys were convicted in November. He signs the execution order, and the day after Christmas is when the execution would take place. They built a massive gallows. Nothing like this has ever been built before. A massive gallows in this little town of Mankato, Minnesota, with nooses for 39. Turns out one of these guys was granted a reprieve to die in prison as opposed to being hung. So the number that Lincoln came to was 39, but only 38 would actually be executed. I don't know. It's a little unclear from the historical record exactly how it is that this one guy escaped the noose the day after Christmas in 1862. So they built this massive gallows, and then they marched these Dakota up the steps to this gallows, put a white cloth hood over them after they slipped the noose over their necks. And the Dakota all held hands. They held hands and they sung. They sung an honor song. And then the executioner with an axe would strike at a rope that was keeping all the doors intact, and then 38 would drop to their death. Now, of course, they would leave them hanging there for over an hour just to make sure. And to put on a good show. Oh, like I said, over 4,000 people came out. Over 4,000 good Christians the day after Christmas would celebrate their president the day after Christmas. Not a good old-fashioned hanging. No, this was exceptional. 38 people being hung with a single gallows. I mean, it's remarkable to even think about. But that's what the good people of Mankato, Minnesota got to witness in day after Christmas, 1862. It's kind of incredible when you think about it. Now, let's put this in perspective. I gave some numbers earlier. Almost 400 tried for waging a war. Now, their territory was the one that was invaded by. It's nice to call them white settlers. That sounds peaceful. These were armed invaders coming in to take possession of Dakota land. They came in to the lands of the Dakota. And I'll explain a little bit why later on. They came in and they took possession of these lands. And, it sounds like, it's going to be, a little house on the prairie or something like that. But these were well-funded, well-financed people that came in with the idea that they were going to exploit what was called the Homestead Act, passed earlier that year, where they get free land just for a filing fee. And, of course, really, really obscure rules associated with it. So there was a lot of fraud, that was involved with this stuff. They get 160 acres, essentially for $20, $30. File some paperwork, live on the land, and after a while you'll get a deed, free and clear. It was advertised. You could see it in the papers, throughout that area. And see, the whole idea was that this was going to stimulate the economy. This was going to make Americans hopeful. Now, this was available to white people, and they said some black people. I don't know how black people took advantage, but I'm sure some did. But the only ones that it was available to were people who could somehow prove they had never taken up arms against the United States. So Native people couldn't file for 160 acres of their own land. This wasn't available to Native people. It was only available to the North. I mean, to Union soldiers and supporters of the Union soldiers. But again, let me put this back in perspective. So Confederate rebels who committed treason against the United States, that resulted in almost 500,000 dead on the Union side. I don't even know about on the Confederate side, but almost 400,000 Union soldiers died in the Civil War, and thousands more who weren't soldiers would die. So how many Confederate soldiers were tried and executed? 0. See, they were treated as if it was a war between sovereigns. Now, it's not like the United States recognized the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America as look, this was a secession. This was treason by definition. Punishable by death, but nobody died. They all skated. Almost a half a million people died as a result of that armed conflict. And look, this isn't, war fought with specific rules and that kind of stuff. But 500,000 casualties from the North, and not a single rebel traitor was executed. But Native people, the Dakota, who had their lands invaded by armed settlers defending their right to live, their sustenance, their ability to live. They were tried in a kangaroo court. and executed. And those who weren't executed would die in prison. Clemency was granted. Now, of course, all you Confederate traders, you couldn't get the free land that the North could. But you know what? You already had land in the South. So the dichotomy in the way Lincoln treated armed rebel soldiers from the South and armed insurrection, essentially, from Native people, completely different. And again, this tribunal did not treat the Native resistance as a lawful war. I mean, in the history books, they kept calling it that. And it certainly lists as, the unending battle of military conflicts that would plague the United States throughout its entire existence. I think I heard only 23 years of the U.S. existence has the United States not been in some form of military conflict. And some of those military conflict includes these wars that they waged against Native people. So let me jump ahead a little bit. Because I think it's important. There's a couple of really important things here, but the Homestead Act, which was passed, it was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, May 20th, 1862. This would allow, and it would stay on the books for like 124 years. It wasn't until 1976 that it would be eliminated, and it got eliminated by another set of laws that regulated, I guess, federal lands. Now, so how did these lands become federal lands? Well, they became federal lands because the United States was pressuring and killing Native people. So in these peace treaties that the United States entered into with the Lakota, and so many other Native peoples, throughout the plains, they herded Native people onto Indian reservations, which essentially were like prison camps. Although they weren't necessarily, bound by fences or walls, prison walls, but they were essentially like concentration camps. And the promise was that they would be taken care of. They would be paid in provisions and money and that kind of stuff. Well, the problem is the United States took the land and never paid up. So you had thousands of Native people, who had their way of life stripped away, and it was never replaced by anything. The United States didn't pay up. They stopped sending the provisions. They stopped making payments. So the Native people had no way to live. And yet they saw white people coming in, taking their lands, changing, the ability to hunt and survive, live off the land. And all that land was taken away. They couldn't live off the land anymore. So the Dakota, who took up arms against the United States and the settlers, which they were one and the same from a Dakota standpoint. I mean, this wasn't Michael Landon with a wife and 3 daughters there. No, that's not what this was. These were men who were going in trying to make money. They had access to free land for all intents and purposes. And of course, they were also fronting for other people who were accumulating a lot more than 160 acres at a whack. So at some point, the Native people rose up. And again, they called it an uprising. And they fought to sustain themselves. They raided some of these villages and these homesteads, these businesses that were being erected on their lands, so they could sustain themselves. That's what would lie at the foundation of this thing. Now, so how does history deal with the Homestead Act? Oh, they tout it as this great accomplishment. John F. Kennedy in 1962 said 100 years ago, the Congress passed the Homestead Act, probably the single greatest stimulus to national development ever enacted. National development. It's funny because nationalism is exactly what developed. It promoted white supremacy, white dominance through a land that was not only occupied but was supporting, and where Native people thrived off that land for thousands and thousands of years. But this achievement that Kennedy boasted of, and again, I got to remember this is John F. Kennedy, the liberal darling, right? The Democratic darling. This isn't just, this isn't Abraham Lincoln. No, they praise this. But like Antonin Scalia would say, we just make this stuff up as we go along. We don't know what we're doing, so we just make it up. Well, and then you recast and you rewrite history to make it sound like it's always just this great thing. So I mean, this is what would lie, at the foundation of the conflict and ultimately the execution. So as I said, these 38 would hang for over an hour. So then what happened? In case you're wondering. So then what happens was they were taken down and they were buried in a mass grave, just piled in a mass grave. Within days, the entire mass grave, these mass graves would be looted. And, what could a bunch of dead Native people have? Physicians, doctors wanted to grab the bodies to study them. And it wouldn't stop there. I mean, we often call it the Dakota 38 plus 2, because within a couple of years, two more notable chiefs would be also executed, and their bodies, or their not just their graves, but their coffins were looted. And there's still family today trying to get their relatives back. Where these many of these things went to Philadelphia, because there was like a medical hospital that wanted to study Native people. So not only do you execute these people, of course, you don't allow any of their traditions to follow them even into the grave, but then you desecrate their bodies even farther. So science can, use them as just experimental cadavers. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. It's pretty remarkable that this kind of thing existed. So, and I'm going to get into this in the next half hour. I'm going to talk about why this is relevant. I mean, why is it relevant? And because we had some callers last week, and we get them from time to time who say, the problem is, identity politics. We can't have Native people or people of color, trying to single out their situations and their circumstances, the oppression and the things that were done to people, and single that out, and we can't allow that to be the foundation of somebody's political stance. Really, we can't. As I said last week, that's great coming from a white person. It's funny because American imperialism would be looked at as something that comes after this, and not until the 20th century. But this was all imperialism. That's exactly what this was. I think it's really, really important that this stuff gets put into context. So before I go to break here, let me put this into context for you. This is the day after Christmas in 1862. In January, I don't know if it was on the 1st or the 2nd, probably just a week after this, would be January of 1863. Now, if that date doesn't ring a bell, that's when Abraham Lincoln would stand up and announce to the world his Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, there's still people, and black people in particular, that are, that think that this was the greatest historical achievement. I mean, look, according to Kennedy, the Homestead Act was this great historical achievement. But we're going to ignore the fact that the Homestead Act would turn out to be the cause for the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. Instead, Lincoln won't be known as the great executioner. He won't be known for this. And you know what? Even if he had executed 300, he still wouldn't be known for it. It's barely even acknowledged. But what is he famous for? Within that same week span, the Emancipation Proclamation, the great emancipator. Oh, the Republicans say, hey, he's a Republican. He freed the slaves. Democrats didn't free the slaves. The Republican did. Yeah, that's right. So put that in. We do need historical context. So when I start with Strange Fruit, it wasn't just black lynchings. People of color have been lynched, executed, massacred by an imperialistic white society since the first white man came on, stepped on this on the land in this hemisphere. All right, we're going to take a break. Before I take a break, though, and have Reggie have me go out with some music here, a couple of things. If you are watching me on Facebook, you realize that I'm not in New York. I'm actually doing the show from my own studio up on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation. No Shawnee Rice, just me. But we are going to take your calls in hour two. But I do want people to realize, that I am doing the show remotely. But I also want to remind people, as Reggie said just before the show started, we are in fund drive mode. We're, for all intents and purposes, we're always at some level in fund drive mode. We're always in need of support from listeners. So again, I want to encourage people to go to the pledge line, and that pledge line is 516-620-3602. You can go online at www.give2wbai.org. That's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org. And whether you call or whether you go online, you can make a one-time donation. You can you become a sustaining member of the station by becoming a we call it a BAI buddy. I personally would be grateful if you mentioned that you are making a donation in the name of this show. It doesn't come to me. It goes to the station. But it sends a signal to the station that you listen to the show. And I realize when we get into the calls in an hour or two, we're going to have some discussions. And people are going to ask, perhaps. I mean, I know it got a little testy last week when it was suggested that we shouldn't bring up the past. We should pretend that we're all Americans and we're all treated equal when we're not. But I'm going to talk about that when we come back from break. Reggie, are you there? Can you cue up some music and have us go out and come back in a couple of minutes?
Oh, yeah, and I got a song that is very apropos what you just finished saying.
All right, let's do it.
I'm not going to tell anyone.
All right, surprise us all. All right, thanks for coming back. This is good stuff, Reg. I appreciate that. What how'd that one jump out for you?
Well, I'll describe it for what it is. The name of the song was "The Coming of the White Man," and that was from the group Exit, a psychedelic rock group back in the 70s, which was predominantly Native, and were artists on the Motown label as well too. And I thought everything that you just said, I think it just added on to that.
Absolutely. Well, and I want to encourage people, because people don't realize where Native people fit into American contemporary music or any of the genres of American music. And I've showed a film downstairs at the Brooklyn Commons, the media room, called Rumble. And if you're not familiar with Rumble, it's called Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World. Features Robbie Robertson and Buffy St. Marie and a whole bunch. Link Ray is he's the title of the film comes from his guitar solo. It's instrumental. It's one of the only songs or music tracks that had no words to it, but it was banned from radio because they thought just the tone of it was too would cause insurrection. But if you get a chance, check it out. Maybe I'll even screen the film again this year, just so people who either have seen it and would like to see it again, or people who haven't seen it can come by. On that note, I am screening a film in January. Look, this is the last show of 2019. We're coming into 2020. And in January, I am screening a film called Indian Horse. For those of you watching on Facebook, this is the film. It's called Indian Horse. It deals with the residential school issue, the exploitation of Native people, even in sports. Both the opportunities that Native people would see through sports, even in these residential schools, and the exploitation of Native people. So look forward to that. And I'm going to do that on January 30th at 7 p.m. downstairs at the Brooklyn Commons, 388 Atlantic Avenue. I'll put some information out throughout the month. Now, I'm not sure if I'm on the schedule for next week or not. I know we are in fund drive mode, and we kind of mix things up sometimes, or change things up with the schedule during these fund drives. So I'm not sure, but we'll sort that. I know, Reggie, you're on vacation next week, so I may end up doing a remote show if I'm on the schedule. We'll see how that goes. But regardless, throughout the month of January, I'll continue to mention that we are screening a film. That's Thursday, January 30th, so the last Thursday of the month, which is usually what I do. I usually try to take the last Thursday of a month and do an event. Most of the time it's a screening of film, but I brought in performers and speakers, and I collaborated with a few other people, the Williams Pipeline issue, environmental issues. So you can look for more of that coming into next year. I'm guardedly optimistic. I'm always optimistic about the future. I think even those of us who have been the victim of some very bad decisions along the way, there's always the opportunity to make corrections and to improve situation. There's opportunities to make it worse too. So, not going to get into the significance of 2020 on the American election stuff. You've got all kinds of other shows that'll discuss that issue. But from a Native standpoint, we are more empowered and more knowledgeable than we've ever been when it comes to understanding how to confront some of these issues. Now, as I was saying earlier, one of the challenges is there are people within American society, white people in particular, and look, I'm not picking on white people. I'm not trying to say that I'm a hater or anything else, but racism, as I've said many times, is a white thing, and there are many people who, while they'll argue to the death that they're not racist, you hear stuff in their tone. I mean, Reggie, you last week was kind of exceptional. We had a couple of people who really tried to take ownership of the airwaves and suggested that it hurts the United States for people to identify themselves as a distinct group that want change. That we should just accept the lot that we've gotten and hope or pretend that all things are equal. But if you look at this history, even the history I'm talking about today, the anniversary, the 157th anniversary of the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. Look, there's a reason that it's Native people. I mean, to be clear, beyond the massacres that would take place, and only a couple of years after this with Sand Creek, and then Wounded Knee, and 30 years, almost 30 years later, and many of the massacres that took place, from the Revolutionary War all the way through. I mean, it's clear why the largest mass execution in the history of the United States would be Native people, because we were in the way. I mean, the difference between what the experience was for enslaved human beings is that even though those enslaved human beings, including Native people and black people, even though they were treated inhumanely, they had value to the white people. So that inhumane treatment was to make them docile, or try to. It didn't always work. That's why you have lynchings. You have lynchings because that hate and that racism, that sense of white men had to constantly remind themselves that they had the power. They had the power to decide who could live, who could die. So lynchings, as frequent as they were, you would never see a situation where you'd see 30 people brought into a court of law run by white people, or 38 people, I should say, and then executed. And of course, when crimes are committed against people of color, and again, I can't help but mention, the Tulsa. I don't even know why they call them the Tulsa riots. That'd be like calling the massacre at Wounded Knee the Wounded Knee riot. I mean, because you received, lead shot, that was a riot. I don't think the numbers are even clear. They're coming up and they're discovering mass graves around Tulsa. They still don't have adequate numbers to say how many black people were killed by white people in all manner. I mean, from lynchings to bombs being dropped from airplanes, and not a single white man was convicted. It was just swept under a rug. And the irony of all that is the Tulsa massacre occurs as the FBI is becoming a thing. Ironically, the first major FBI, beyond the scandal associated with the Teapot Dome scandal, the first major investigation would be only 50 miles from Tulsa, on the Osage murders, where white men were literally in the most grotesque display of premeditated murder you could ever find, where white men would actually marry a Native woman to steal and have children to steal oil revenue from the Osage. And they had the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, fledgling FBI. The story is recounted in the book Killers of the Flower Moon, The Birth of the FBI, the Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI by David Grant. I encourage you to read the book. I've talked about it. In fact, I offered it as a premium here on WBAI. I encourage you to check out the book. And it is going to become a movie, but I still encourage you to read the book first. Look, I don't know what Hollywood. I know what Hollywood's done with Native imagery in the past. This may just end up being, hero worship to an FBI agent, as far as I know. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese could do something better than that. But, having read the book, I could see how they could, follow the trajectory of the FBI and make it sound like it was an isolated, kind of thing. And I'm not taking too much away from the FBI agent who did get a conviction. But the idea that they narrowed the scope and didn't treat it as a mass serial killings, perpetrated by the broad-based white population. Said they made it sound, it's just a few bad eggs. But, it's, again, the reason I bring some of this stuff up on this show, because you're not hearing this stuff otherwise, folks. And while it may offend some people, and Reggie I felt like Reggie was trying to prep you guys, that I was somehow going to, I'd be spewing some information that was going to be, incite violence. And no, I'm telling you just some basic history that you've been denied. Look, when I do my events downstairs, I oftentimes hear people, well-educated people of all, diverse crowd that comes to my events. Well-educated people come in and they say, I can't believe that my education has betrayed me like this. I've got a PhD. I've got a master's degree. I've got this many years of college. I've traveled the world. I've done this, and this. But I've never heard any of this stuff. You know what? The people who live in Mankato, Minnesota, they didn't even know. I think there's a marker there that says this is the site of the hanging of 38 Dakota. More people are becoming familiar with it because of a ride that Native people have began. I don't know how many years ago. It's almost, I guess, 10 years old now. They've been doing this ride that marks how these people were brought to this trial and ultimately would be executed. And so they do this ride, and it starts like right around my birthday time, around December 20th or so. No, but earlier than that, the week before that. And they end up coming to Mankato. There are these riders today in Mankato, Minnesota. And they do a bit of an event there in Mankato, Minnesota. But most people in that area had no idea. And it's only because we are raising awareness through not just the ride, but a film that came out, the Dakota 38, a film that I've shown downstairs at the Brooklyn Commons a number of times. A heartbreaking film. A heartbreaking film, not just because they recount the history, but you see the struggle that Native people have today because of that very history. In the film, the Dakota 38, there's one individual, Billy Ray Dumark was his name. He's in the film, and he struggles. He struggles even with the interaction with white people. I mean, the film was produced by a white guy from the New York City area, from Long Island, and so he struggles. He struggles with this this, not just the film, but the interaction that these writers are having with white people, and some white people are being gracious. They're helping them out. They give them a tire for one of their horse trailers. They let's see what else. They fed them. They let them stay when the weather got real bad. And so the guy who produces the film, or one of the producers, he says, I don't understand why people aren't embracing these people. I mean, they're doing everything they even got shirts printed saying thank you in Lakota. I mean, how can these people do anything more? And what's not understood is that these affluent white people are living on this land that was theirs. That Dakota land. You can't just go through and see these people with these large ranches and these affluents, using their barns to host these people. Their barns are nicer than the homes that these people are living in, if they even have homes. So Billy Ray Dumark was having a tough time. But as the ride continued, he seemed to settle in and feel really optimistic and upbeat about not only this ride, but he looked forward to the next ride. But when you watch the film, at the end, they talk about they do that in memorial, part of the film, where people who may have died during, since the filming or whatever else. And you can appreciate that, in the time that it takes to produce a film, that you're gonna, some people just, they die. But then Billy Ray Dumark's name shows up there. It doesn't say why. Gives the years, his birth date and the year of his death. That same, it would be that following year. He never made it to the next ride. So why didn't he make it to the next ride? Well, he committed suicide. So all of the struggles that seem to be washing away a little bit, some of the psychological, the damage done to a Billy Ray Dumark from the conditions that Native people are living in today, would become too much for him. Now, am I blaming some individual for the death of Billy Ray Dumark? No. It's policy. It's conditions. It's the history brought forward. So when I get George calling up, condemning this idea of identity politics, well, like I said, that's great coming from a white man who, even if you went through if you were an family of Irish immigrants or Italian immigrants or whoever, you were able to transition. Even Jewish people. This isn't about white passing. This is about being accepted into the family of white men. I don't have to it's not tough to remind people. The owner of the Washington football team with the racist slur of a name, he's Jewish. Do you think he'd know better? Sure he does. Doesn't matter. Why? Because he can harbor as much racism as any white man. It doesn't matter that he was Jewish. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I often talk about how she used the doctrine of Christian discovery, a Jewish woman, liberal darling of the Supreme Court. It isn't just Antonin Scalia saying, well, we don't know what we're doing, we're just making it up as we go along. No. Ruth Bader Ginsburg cites Vatican Church dogma as a way to rule against Native people. So, look, I mean, I've heard some people call me, oh, yeah, well, you look white. You know what? You're right. I could probably pass. But in order to do that, what do I have got to do? Now, maybe all you folks were able to rid yourself of your identity from whatever your mother country is. And embrace this idea of Americanism, nationalism, the national. What did John F. Kennedy say? The single greatest stimulus to national development. Maybe you're a part of that national development, but in order for me to do it, I've got to abandon not a place that I left. I've got to abandon something that is being stripped away. Look, if you're an immigrant or a refugee and you leave wherever the war-torn areas of your homeland is to come here to start a new life, that's not what I did. My history, the history of Native people, is having their lives altered. And I know, look, there's some people listening to the show or listen to WBAI. Well, all people have gone through this. The first thing somebody wants to do is, well, Native people mistreated other Native people. And that's the justification. That's the way people can get through this stuff and say, "Oh no, we don't bear any guilt. We don't bear any responsibility for what took place in the past." The problem is, it's not in the past. Billy Ray Dumar committed suicide the year after he did this ride. And look, that was suicide. Nobody's responsible for that. It was a decision he made. Based on what? Based on the current policies. Look, I said it's no surprise that the largest mass execution in the history of the United States was Native people. It's also no surprise to me that Native people top every list you don't want to be upon, including the victims of the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. But suicide rates, substance abuse, prison population, death by cop, missing and murdered indigenous women. I'm not talking about problems that plagued us in the past. I'm saying the problems that plague us today. Why? Why do they plague us today? Because we have still not recovered from what was taken. And to the extent that the United States tried to create a welfare state for Native people, and then said, well, we shouldn't have done that. We should have never allowed them to live and maintain distinction on Native territories. We should have just forced them to assimilate. That's genocide too. Assimilation is genocide. Whatever you do from a nation state to make a people cease to exist, and you still hear it. You will still hear politicians today talk about what a mistake it was not to be more aggressive. I don't know how the hell you could have been more aggressive about and trying to indoctrinate Native people. You took our children away. You put them in residential schools. You cut off their hair. You changed their names. You put white man's clothing on them. Gave them biblical names. You indoctrinated them in your religious beliefs. How much more aggressive could you have been? You sterilized our women. You took away our ability to reproduce. You did everything you could to not only eliminate our population through killing, sterilization, taking our children, but even the ones who lived, you did everything you could do to change us into something that emulated you. And then you got the gall to take our image and call yourself Redskins or Warriors or Redmen for your high school football team or your college or your pro sports team. You'll take some element of our identity. You got the gall to take an identity that you actively, through military, through church, through school, through everything, through starvation, through isolation, tried to eliminate us. And then you got the gall to use us for mascots. So when I get a caller, and look, I'm willing to hear you. Look, by all means, callers, when you call in, by all means, I want to hear what you have to say. For better or worse. I mean, so when I don't know why racists listen to WBAI. But I guess, I don't know. I used to listen to Christian radio stations so I could understand what the hell they were talking about. So maybe that's the same thing. But these trolls who get on in my Facebook group page or who call into the radio station and then want to say, well, the problem is we're not truly progressives. We're all hung up on this identity politics thing. And when I called someone, I said, well, that's fine for you to say as a white man. He says, I'm not a white man. I'm a human. Well, okay. But you're white. And you're judging people who have a different experience than you have and whose experience still has effect in the lives that we live today. I travel and you know, I hate to belabor the point, but I live on a native territory. And we're not a poor native territory, but we're still suffering from the effects. We've got courts that rule against us. We've got a governor trying to steal $1 billion from native gaming. Why? Because they don't think we're entitled to it. Native people shouldn't be able to be affluent. We got to stop that. We got to make sure that we tax them. We got to make sure that even when we can't tax them, we'll find some other way to take something from them. We're going to limit their land use rights. We're gonna constantly. So whether you're the governor of Oklahoma or you're the governor of the state of New York, you still got your hands in our pockets. This isn't 157 years ago. I mean, I don't really feel threatened that I'm going to be executed, but I was imprisoned. I went through a sham of a trial. In my lifetime, I did this. I went through this experience. I saw the prejudice, the overt racism from a U.S. prosecutor, and even from the judge, and of course the jury. No Native people were on that jury. I don't even think there were any people of color on the jury that I faced. So how the hell could they relate to my experience? And of course, as always, just like with the mascot issue and so many other things, you find some turncoats, some sellouts. I mean, they may have had some Native people testify in this weak trial against this almost 400 Dakotas 157 years ago. I'm sure they did. All right. Before we take a break at the top of the hour here, let me again remind people we are in fund drive mode. I encourage you to go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Make a pledge of any size, a one-time donation. You can even, if you go online and you go to give2wbai.org, that's www.give2wbai.org. You can do it all online. You can even follow the prompts to make a donation via text. I encourage you to become a WBAI buddy. I'd love to have 20, 30, 40 people sign up as buddies. If it's $5 a month, $10 a month, by all means, make it $100 a month. But I'd love to have more people engaged in the show. And you don't have to agree with everything I said. Look, what I'm telling you about what took place in Mankato, Minnesota 157 years ago, you can not like what I said, but you can't deny it. It happened. These are facts. This is history. You've been denied, and maybe you're okay with that being denied. But that's not what this show is about. This show is about trying to teach people so they better understand a Native perspective. And I'm not saying you got to agree with the Native perspective, but just know that it exists and why it exists. I mean, I got to tell some of this history. So, again, I encourage you to go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Make a donation. Support WBAI. Support free thought radio, free speech radio. I know there's some people who'd like to shut me down. And this whole idea that I'm the angry Indian, look, don't give me that. Am I happy about what took place 157 years ago? Of course not. There's a lot that I'm not happy with, but to try to characterize me as a white-hating, angry Indian, give me a break. Most of you know. And look, and I applaud those of you who call up immediately after I get one of these trolls on the line. And we'll see what happens today. We're gonna go to the phone lines. We're gonna take a break. We're gonna go to the phone lines. So while the song's up playing, it only takes you a little while to get through and go through the prompts to make a donation. So go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. And when we come back, here's the line to call into the studio. It's 212-209-2877. Reggie will probably introduce you as callers because I'm not in studio to see the phone lines light up. And Reggie will give me a prompt and let me know when people are on the line. So again, 212-209-2877. I look forward to hearing what you've got to say. I don't know. I know this telling this story can leave many people speechless. Hopefully, apparently the people in Mankato, Minnesota, in 1862, day after Christmas, had no trouble recovering from, whatever, their celebration of the birth of their Savior. So hopefully you guys have recovered from whatever you did yesterday, so you can participate in the show. I look forward to it. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. We'll take a break here and go out with another tune, and we'll come back to your calls, 212-209-2877. That's the number to call to join me on the program. All right. Hey, that's Johnny Cash from his Bitter Tears album, and that's called Lake Perfidy.
That is correct, sir.
And that's called Lake Perfidy. Now,
yep.
So for those of you who don't know, Johnny Cash actually spent some time among the Senecas. And he came by and hung out for a little bit, and he learned this story. And what he's talking about is the construction of the Kinzua Dam. And the whole idea was it was one of several plans put forward by the Army Corps of Engineers that would stop some of the flooding of Pittsburgh. And it wasn't even the best plan. But because we have this idea of sacrifice zones and sacrifice people, this was the one that could have less impact on non-native people. So creating this dam would essentially put 10,000 acres of Seneca land into a flood zone. And they indeed flooded it in the beginning. Since they lowered the level, the Senecas never had that land flooded again. But the land was condemned by the Army Corps of Engineers. The village was burned, including longhouses, even churches, playgrounds, schools, places where there was school. The people were moved out of their lands were bulldozed and burnt. Their homes and their farms were bulldozed and burnt. Again, the land along the Allegheny River was the most fertile. Why? Because that's what rivers do. They replenish the soil. So they were denied that land. And then they were put in these crappy little government houses. They created little towns. One of them they called Jimerson Town, which is where they just moved the people to. There were graveyards that were flooded. So, the corn planter, can you swim issue, look, those lands are still there. I've been there. I've been down to this flooded area, or this floodplain area. And the United States did something illegal to do it. They had no legal authority to do this eminent domain kind of thing. They broke the law. Ultimately, they would try to pay the Senecas some compensation. But it was, how do you compensate for taking somebody's livelihood away? Many of the Seneca farmers who were the most successful in that area would never farm again. John F. Kennedy would actually apologize to the Senecas for this. Well, now, why would he apologize? Well, what he had to apologize for was supporting the Kinzua Dam project. Now, I quoted John F. Kennedy earlier, but in this situation, Kennedy knew what they were doing was wrong. But here's the thing. He needed Pennsylvania. Sound familiar? He needed Pennsylvania to become the president of the United States. So he had to support this idea of flooding on Seneca land, which was essentially on the New York side, to protect one of the largest cities in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. Had he opposed the Kinzua Dam project, this Lake Perfidy, as Johnny Cash would call it, he probably wouldn't have beat Nixon in that election. So afterwards, he would actually write a letter, essentially apologize. They actually have it. They used to have it in the museum, the Seneca Museum. Of course, that letter is not worth a damn thing. Acknowledging the wrong. Look, that's what I get in this show, right? I get a lot of people, oh, yeah, we acknowledge that stuff was done bad in the past. But, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, get with the program. Enjoy the fruits of being, we gave you the Bible, we gave you citizenship. No, you impose the Bible, you impose citizenship, although not all of us accept it, either one. So anyway, I do want to go to the calls. I want to remind people that during the program, if you're not ready to call in and have a conversation, and it is a conversation, so to remind people of one of the callers last week, this isn't.
And
this
speaking
show,
of conversation, John,
yes.
We do have a caller on the line.
All right, we'll get right to it. But I want to remind people,
Okay.
this is about a conversation. This is about trying to invite people to have an exchange. So if you don't want me to participate in your soliloquy, then you probably shouldn't call in, because I will engage. And I'm not because I want to contradict you or interrupt you. I want to add to the conversation. It's a conversation. So I want to remind people again. The number is what do I got here? Okay, it's 212-209-2877. That's the number to call to be a part of the show. And look, if you're angry about the program, I want to hear it. Some, but if you want to add to the conversation, then I look forward to that as well. All right, so we'll go to it. Caller, you're up first. What's your name? And again, I'm not trying to track you. I just want to be polite. So, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, my name is Jan. I'm calling from the Bronx.
Hey, Jen, thanks for calling in.
I don't necessarily want to engage in conversation, but I just want to thank you so very much for the education that you're giving me that I never ever learned in school, in all the years of school. The only thing is, I want to be a buddy to your show, for giving me and giving the listeners so much of an education. But you have to say the number a little bit more slowly.
Okay,
I tried to call and I kept getting the wrong number.
Well, thank you for that critique. I do sometimes talk too fast. The number is 516-620-3602. 516.
Okay, very good.
Now you can also go online and you could go to give2wbai.org. And you can do it that way. But I appreciate I appreciate you listening. And I also encourage you to come out to my events. Like I said, every last Thursday of the month.
I know. But the thing, I would love to. You have no idea. But the thing is, I'm all the way in the Bronx, and you're all the way down in. Those events are all the way down in Brooklyn, and I don't have transportation.
I hear you. I understand.
The only reason I would be at every single event of yours because this learning, I mean, it's invaluable. I mean, I take notes and everything. And pass it on to my kids.
Well, I appreciate it.
This is really.
They did a
really
recent study, and they determined that there is essentially no mention of Native people in any mainstream history courses, high school or college, after the turn of the 20th century. So after 1900. We aren't mentioned at all. So there might be a mention of the massacre at Wounded Knee,
and my kids too. Nothing at all.
Yeah, no.
And I want to say, how right you are about one thing that you said. Other, people who are not indigenous people can never, ever, ever walk in your shoes or know what it's like. I don't care what they say, how compassionate, how leftist, political. Never, ever walk in your shoes. Thank you so much again. I appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate the call. And look, I wouldn't want anybody else to have to walk in the shoes, but I do want people to understand where we come from, and that's so I appreciate the call and appreciate the sentiment, and of course I appreciate your desire to become a WBAI buddy in the name of Let's Talk, and that's the name of the show. So if you're listening, if you're not on the line anymore, when you scroll down, the show is just called Let's Talk. So just two words. You don't have to. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. So just look for Let's Talk as you scroll down on the list of shows that you want to become a buddy in the name of, and I greatly appreciate it. We got anybody else on the line yet, Reggie?
Yes, we do.
All right, we'll go right to the next caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name and where are you calling from?
That's me.
Yeah, that's you. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Bill from New Jersey.
Hey, Bill, what's on your mind?
I have to say, I'm calling in to give you your props, John. I'm going to say that as far as hosting a radio show, and I've been listening to BAI for 20 years, you're the best host I've ever heard.
Well, thank you for
whether
that.
Someone loves the show or not, as far as being prepared, the knowledge, being able to engage in whatever topic, and especially being able to suffer the fools. You know, I have to give you your props. I don't think I've ever heard anyone do it any better than you do it.
Well, I appreciate that. And look, there's a reason. There's ignorance, and then there's willful ignorance. And ignorance is something you can shine a light on and empower people. But if somebody just absolutely chooses to maintain, some sort of oblivious, ideology, even when new information is presented, there's not a whole lot I can do with that. But I try to give people their due. I try to give people a chance to, make your compelling argument. But you're going to have to, hear back from me. If you're going to call into the show and you're going to offer some comments that, you're going to have to get some response. And if that response makes you angry, then maybe you shouldn't have called in. But look, even the folks who I don't agree with, when they call in, they do give me an opportunity to have perhaps a deeper conversation, because it's one thing for me to talk about what we experience, but when I experience it right on the show, that's a demonstration for everybody.
Yeah, and I have to tell you that I believe one of the reasons why you get some of the calls that you do is it's kind of a white man thing that when someone challenges their white privilege, they must lash out at this person. So you non-white person that is speaking your mind and calling us out, we have to attack back. They see it as an attack. It's not an attack. It's just speaking the truth. But they must attack back because you're not laying down and falling in line and staying in your place. So they've got to come at you.
Well,
it's a weird thing.
I appreciate the call and I appreciate the sentiment, but and here's the thing. I am hoping that enough people who hear some of the stuff that I talk about, that when they confront somebody, look, even folks with white privilege, there's a way to use that privilege for good. And part of the thing is we need non-native, we need white allies. The only way you can combat, it's not enough to say you're not, I've talked about this in the show before, it's not enough to say you're not racist. If you're not anti-racist, if you don't take some role, and not in every instance, but at least when you're in the most comfortable situation, if you don't confront it a little bit, say, well, here's what you don't know. And, and whether nobody's got to ascribe my name to where they learned something, but say, well, here's something I heard the other day, and this might change your perspective. When you're talking to somebody who's harboring some of this angst over being taught some truth. I mean, and so again, I'm not trying to demonize white people. I mean, most white people aren't responsible for the situation that exists today, but they can play a role in helping to make some corrective action. And so that's the whole idea. The whole idea is to not just, I'm not trying to give everybody a pass, but at the same time, I'm trying to embolden people to stand up to it and confront it where they can confront it. So, Bill, I really appreciate the call. All right. Reg, we got anybody else on the line yet?
Yes, we do.
All right. Well, we'll keep them coming. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi there. Thank you for taking my call. I'm Elle from Long Island.
It's good to hear from you, Elle.
All right. Thank you. I really, truly enjoy your program, and I welcome the interface that you're having with your audience. And I've listened, and my question, there's always a beginning. And I try to get as close as possible to the beginning. I read the book, Wounded Knee. I buried my heart at Wounded Knee. I have Wounded Knee by D. Brown some years ago. And I have the book, which was before, shall I say, the first version of Wounded Knee, which I found to be a book that I read it and had to put it down, cried, then picked it up, read some more. And I told my son about the book, and he read the book. That's why I have D. Brown's Wounded Knee. All of that to say this. I also read Facing Mount Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. And I did a report, and I'll just say it's over 30 years ago. No, not that long. My goodness, I've been here for 30 years. But let's say 15 years ago, okay, I did a book report, 15 or 20 years. And it was about the Hopi Nation. And I found it extremely interesting because in my research, I noted that there were teepees in Africa, and there was, with the Hopi Nation and the Gikuyu people of Kenya, there was this story, and I won't say, story is a bad noun for it, belief that from across the wide waters would come a ship with a pale face. You will welcome them, and they will deceive you. They will kill you and take your land. And that was the Gikuyu people of Africa. But it was also the Hopi here in this country. Now, I do thank Dr. not Horace, but Dr. Oh my goodness, what is his name? He is the first ancient African doctor of history, of African history in this country. When I say WBAI offered his book at one time, he was interviewed on the air. And the book was for the cost of what you offered, $75, which would include the book plus your donation to the station. That book now, if one looks up on the
Amazon, yeah,
$400 to $600.
Wow.
It's a pack book. But see, if you want people not to know the truth, then you make it extremely difficult. Who would pay? All right.
Well, and that's just it. A lot of these excellent pieces of work don't stay in print very long. So when we offer some of these books in print, while they're in print on WBAI, it's because we're connected to the source material. And
right.
Granted, I mean we do give the book as a gift for a donation, so it's not a sale of a book. But you're right. When these books go out of print, they can be very, very difficult to ever get your hands on it again. And I know we live in a time of electronic media and that kind of thing, but I'll tell you, having that book in hand, and again, you talked about Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I mentioned it earlier in the show. If you haven't read Killers of the Flower Moon, I encourage you to do it. That's another one that'll pull at your heartstrings, and you realize that when you're talking about in the 20th century, the level of depravity that can be associated with this greed and this avarice and this idea of taking from somebody, and what people are willing to do to do that, the premeditation. It's an incredible book, and like I said, I know it's going to become a movie, but man, you've got to read the book. So I encourage Al, if you haven't checked that one out, I'd encourage you.
May I just say one thing?
Sure.
And I'll be brief as possible. You know, what I found so horrific in that book when I read it was, they say that Indians scalped the soldiers. It wasn't the Indians that started that.
You're right.
Scalping. Okay?
Yeah.
Number two, the women, what did they do? They cut out the women's private parts and used it as not bandanas, but headbands.
Yep.
You have to read that book. That is why the second print of the book is not as
graphic,
prolific, is that the correct word for it? Yeah. As the first. And I cried. And I'm a soldier, okay?
Well,
but I cried.
I mean, if you don't feel
Like,
emotion when you hear and see and witness, some of the stuff, even through accounts of it, then then you should check your pulse, because some of the stuff is pretty horrific. So, Al, I want to thank you so much for the call. It's always good to hear from you, and I appreciate you're adding your take to the show. I appreciate it very much.
We have another caller, John.
All right, well, let's get to it, and then maybe we'll fit two more before we get to the bottom of the hour. Look, great callers, and again, I'm not just saying that because you guys are supporting my telling of some of this stuff. It's great to have people add to the show. So, caller, you're up next. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, John. It's Donna Fan Boyle calling from
Langhorne, Pennsylvania. Hi, Donna. Thank you for calling and being part of the show.
Hi. Last week when those guys called in and they were just so racist. I mean, that's all I can say is they were just being so racist. And I think what caught me is that, a lot of this has to do with the education, the lack of education.
And the willful ignorance.
Yes. And that natives are not talked about or taught about in modern day history, and how natives are part of the modern day world and, we're contributing members of society. And so I think when those kind of men call in that did last week, they feel like they are still dealing with some kind of savage or warrior or, and a lot of them have been to these schools or been around schools where they have these mascots, and natives are made to look like a stereotype, warrior. And I think it gets their dander up, and they feel like they need to fight back when you talk about what white people have done to natives.
Well, and and there's a certain sentiment that many of these people have that we should appreciate what has become of our lives. So whether it's the mascot issue, and we're supposed to be honored by this mockery that they make of us, or whether we're supposed to feel grateful because they want to claim that we somehow have achieved equality through the U.S. Constitution or enlightenment through their Bible or whatever. I mean, it was interesting to listen to. I think it was George when he first called in, and the indication was that we were wasting the land with our occupation of it, which was exactly the sentiment that the government held at the time that we were being screwed out of our land. He not only did he make this phone call and then got mad because I said, well, that's interesting coming from a white guy, and got mad over that. He followed through. I don't know if you saw any of the exchange on Facebook, but he went onto my Facebook group page and then went on to say, well, John Kane believes. I'm thinking, you're going to come on my page and tell my group members what I believe? They can read what I write and know what I believe. I mean, but we mixed it up again, and it's really amazing to me. This really gets to the issue about white supremacy, because when you feel that when you can be that arrogant and that narcissistic about the views that you hold, whether it's this view that somehow capitalism ended slavery, which is not true, or that oppressed people can be racist too. No, I agree we can be racially biased, and that bias is based on history. But unless we've been empowered to inflict a different superiority-inferiority dynamic, then we can't be racist, because racism is based on power. It's based on having the power to subjugate, to subdue, vanquish, if you will, a people that you think that are lesser than you. And while there are plenty of people of color who harbor some resentment from history, and look, do I harbor some of it? Sure, but I don't harbor it against every white person that I see. I harbor it against the policies that are still in existence, the systems that are still in place. So the whole idea of the conversations, Donna, that you and I have, even the mascot issue, if we don't begin to confront the systems of racism, the systems of oppression, including the exploitation of native imagery and again the recounting of the same scalping stuff, the same Trail of Tears stuff, and making a mockery of it. If we don't confront that stuff, then then people get the sense that it's okay, that you can make light of the trauma that people have gone through, and by doing so, you continue that trauma.
Right, and also that like this weekend, I faced a person who made a Facebook comment about how it's this mascot that Ben Shamon uses, the Redskin, is so honorable, and because they always respected the badass Native warriors. And it's like, okay, so that's all you think that Native people were, and that's the thing that created genocidal policies and extermination policies against Natives, because that's what Natives were thought of, as just some badass warriors, bloodthirsty warriors.
Evil. I mean, if you can demonize Native people, and now we can use the word bad like it's a compliment, but no, it wasn't. I mean, the idea of creating Native people as demonic. I mean, look at this woman down in Bolivia, who refers to as they did this coup against Evo Morales. She has a history of referring to Native culture as satanic. So, look, I realize that there's colleges that use the devil as their mascot, and they can make light of it. That's fine. We can argue whether the devil really exists or not. But if you want to go to Duke and be a blue devil, by all means, go and be a blue devil, I guess. But the whole idea that you can make a mockery of Native people who have had this tragic history of with our interface with white men, look, we're gonna stand up to it. But and I saw this moron that that sent you these messages on Facebook, and he's got some mental issues. That guy, I mean, he claims to be autistic.
Yes.
I don't know if he's autistic, but I think he's definitely he's mentally unstable. And I've seen he posted images of shooting, of gunplay, and he actually got into a fist fight with the Secretary of Education under the Obama administration, and then he got thumped up by him, and I said, "Well, he picked on me." No, you started the conflict with him. He misidentified himself, and I mean, this is a truly strange individual.
Right. Well, you can see how he is. He attacks people. I mean, he attacked me personally on my personal messenger. And that's what he does. He attacks people and starts, trouble with people. And then when they fight back,
claim that he's being picked on,
in trouble because he's on the spectrum of some autism thing. But then, like you said, the videos, like I watched those videos of him shooting, with his gun and spewing hateful things, and he was just deranged. And it's very scary when you've got somebody like that personally messaging you and not knowing what kind of behavior are they, going to display.
Well, and I also recall that he also posts a bunch of sexual imagery too. I mean, sexualizing Native people in a way that is really uncalled for. And and for he skirts that line between the standards that Facebook claims to have. So he'll put somebody without showing specific genitalia, of women, but in all other facets, naked images of Native women on his Facebook page. I mean, this guy's just absolutely deplorable. I mean, he's disgusting.
And he is a member of NAGA, and certain ones of them who have been ugly in the past, who are not autistic and who are very successful people, support him. And so that just shows what NAGA's about, that they would allow, like, you can't even rein in your own people. You can't educate your own people enough.
Well, and just to be clear, I mean,
so how are you going to do that?
When we use this expression NAGA, it's just this racist organization of Native and non-Native people, but some twisted Native people who support this idea of mascots, like that somehow that is, it's also got a bunch of frauds and fakes and that kind of stuff involved in it. But they also get funded and they get supported from the Washington football team, and like you said, there's some affluent white people who bank this kind of thing. And so, I mean, I hate, I almost hate to talk about the organization because it like validates it as an organization, but it's important to know that they are organized and they do, they're well funded, and they they look the other way, even on the most misogynistic kind of posts. I mean, I remember when they used to have that guy who wrote the kids story, that Andre Bilodeau or whatever his name was.
Yeah, Andre.
He used to say at least there's a standard. He's, well, we shouldn't be doing this and we shouldn't be doing that. Even though he supported the idea of the word redskin, he felt like there were certain, going in red face and doing all of he at least openly condemned that. Although that's exactly what these mascots invite. And then they got rid of him because apparently perhaps it was the stance that he took on some of this stuff that he thought was a little over the top. No, you got to be all in with these guys. And so, and again, it's interesting that the range of racism that we experience as Native people, it can be like the guys who called in last week, who may be absolutely against the mascot issue, but still hold this sense that Native people have been well served. Even though the past is ugly and that kind of stuff, you're in a place now that you should just accept that we're all one big happy family and accept your assimilation. And it's just amazing when you talk about a spectrum. Now there's a wide spectrum of people who maybe they should have a racism spectrum disorder, where some of these people can have any range of disorder associated with their white privilege and white supremacy. I don't know.
Right, but I did want to tell you one thing. I had a conversation with our friend Mo. You know who I'm talking about?
Who?
Mark.
Oh, yeah, whatever. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was supposed to join us on a radio show and bailed, if I recall.
So we have been having conversations, personal message conversations, and it was interesting because they, NAGA claims that they're going in and they're going to educate as long as they can help them keep their mascot. They're going to educate them how to use it properly and how not to be, demeaning and degrading. And when I'm having this conversation with him, and I'm saying, well, how are you going to force them to do this? And he said, oh, we're not going to force anybody to do anything. We're just going to make suggestions. Oh, okay. So there's going to be no education. You're just helping them keep their mouth.
And these guys are really equipped to educate anybody about anything. They don't know anything. They have no cultural background, especially the guy you're talking about who's a fraud. He's not native anyway. He's just a fake. But I mean, even the native people, the people who may be enrolled. I mean, look, the governor of Oklahoma is an enrolled Cherokee, and look at he's acting as a white politician against native gaming in Oklahoma. So it doesn't matter whether you can show some little blood quantum card or something like that. That doesn't mean that you have any culture and that you have any allegiance, or a loyalty to a culture or to a past or to your ancestry. It just means that you get to play the Indian card, is like you have some sort of exclusive voice to weigh in.
Right. Well, if you're more in allegiance with a football team or a sports team than you are to your own bloodline or your culture, then you have nothing to say. You have nothing to. There's nothing. You have nothing to contribute
to the conversation. Yeah, there's nothing you can add to a conversation about. Certainly about educating anybody. I mean, look, and I remember when this Andre guy was trying to, rewrite history about where the word redskin came from, and as much as there have been, study after study that showed the etymology of the word associated with the taking of scalps and all that other stuff, he wanted to make it sound like, no, it was only exclusively used, for Native people whose warriors wore makeup. And they try, and of course, it's not to say that Native people didn't, dye their skin, for effect, but that's not where the word came from. It wasn't about red makeup. It was white people viewing their pale skin as compared to our skin of a darker color and with a more of a reddish hue to it. I mean, we would never have called ourselves redskin without white people suggesting that name. And, so then, while Native people did begin to use that word because it became a part of the English vernacular, in our language, the word for red is almost always associated with the word for blood. So we would never have called ourselves, a bloody skinned people. I mean, that's not, we just never would have done that. So the only reason that red applies because it was taken it was taken from the white man's context, referring to us as being a people of distinct color from them, and then reducing us, and this is where the word red skin is even worse than the word red man. Or red race or whatever else. I mean, I find all of it a little offensive, but the idea of reducing somebody to the most the outermost part of our anatomy and say, no, we aren't a man. They were just a skin, like we're just a red sack that somebody stuffed full of something that they barely call humanity, and that's why the N word, which is again associated with the color of skin, and then gets reduced where they don't even have to acknowledge that the N word is referring to a human being, and it's the same thing with the R word. If you can just reduce it down to a phrase that eliminates the need to acknowledge the humanness, the human being part of a person, then you've accomplished something, and that's what these words, and that's what mascots do in general. Not just the R word, but all of them. They just reduce us to and if not subhuman. I mean, the word animate and animal are related. So the idea of reducing us to an animated character is to say, okay, so we're not real. We're real. We're just an animated piece of history, or that they've created. So
right.
Well, Donna, as always. Excuse me. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one more thing. When they talk about like these great anthropologists and these people who have written history, there's a lot that's lost in the translation. It's the English version. It's how they translated things, and so how can you ignore native history that's been talked about and handed down from through the language, and then write it in a book and translate it into the English language? There's so much lost in translation.
Well, and that goes for everything from the Bible they claim to follow to finding these out of this sea of scientific researchers, the ones who will deny climate change or the effects that man has on global warming, all that stuff. Look, we can find somebody who has a degree that will say that something means what everybody else knows it to mean. They'll try to deny and rewrite history, and that's what some of these guys have done. And it's a fool's game to even to give any of these people any kind of credibility, even if they've done some good work someplace else. But when you start, it's amazing to me. Like these school board officials and these, forget about lawyers. I mean, they're just, they're like prostitutes anyway. But the idea that these school officials, whose job it is to help shape young minds. So whether you're a teacher, an administrator, or a board member, school board member, the idea that you would negate and neglect your responsibility to help shape young minds, or if not shape young minds, at least provide them with proper information is just beyond me.
Yep.
Well, Don, I want to thank you so much for joining the show again, and I look forward to a good 2020 and having you join me many more times.
Okay. Thank you for having me on.
All right, that's Donna from Langhorne, Pennsylvania, one of my my comrades, and not just. And look, we don't just fight the mascot issue. It's one of those things that brought us together. But Donna's on the front line with environmental issues and race issues in general. So again, for those people who say, yeah, why are you guys wasting your time on this subject? Why aren't you dealing with stuff more important? Well, look, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Reggie, we got anybody else on the line? Do I need to get the number out again?
Yeah, give out the number again.
All right. The number is 212-209-2877. Look, one of the complaints that I sometimes get from callers is that I from some callers, they'll say, I allow other callers to be on the line too long. And look, this show is about a conversation. It's not about sound bites. It's not about just trying to, no gotcha stuff. I'm not trying to catch somebody to say something that I can, seize on. Although I do that sometimes, but usually it's because I'm trying to get somebody to offer something that I can seize on in a good way. So, look, I do try to give people adequate time to voice their opinions. We blew through the bottom of the hour, so we're going to take this thing. What time we got to get out of here, Reg?
We could take it up to 55.
All right, we'll take it right up to 4:55. So again,
and we do have another caller on the line.
All right, let me give the number out one more time, and then we'll go to that caller. The number, again, it's 212-209-2877. I also want to give out the pledge line again, and I'm going to say it slow, 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a pledge, become a WBAI buddy, to make a one-time donation, whatever suits you. Again, the number to call in to be a part of the show is 212-209-2877. All right, caller, you're up next. So what's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, this is Patty from New Jersey. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So, I've been reading, I've had it next to my bed for so long, and I finally started reading it because I got sick and I was spending extra time in bed. The Narrative of the Life of an American Slave by Frederick Douglass.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a pretty heavy work. And I'm always impressed, is a word, by how incredibly ignorant many of my fellow Americans who went through public schooling and the whole jazz, and they're so unaware of the experience of the African Americans in America, historically speaking. You could say present day as well. Also, indigenous people. Do you think that there are certain venues for parents who are raising children and help to familiarize children with a more realistic historical education of life and times of the American civilization to date?
Well, the problem is, even and whether you intend it or not, even as you say that, it makes it sound like, is there like a timestamp that we can say how Native people were at this moment in time in their history, or in their in their long past or the recent past? And the problem with that is, no matter what we do, and so whether we're talking about anybody's experience, especially any distinct groups of people, it always should be taken into context of what else was happening in history. I think the important thing to talk about, like, and the reason I talked so much about the executions in Mankato, Minnesota, is to understand that Abraham Lincoln signed that execution order, and then a week after the execution, he's given the Emancipation Proclamation speech. And if you don't put those things in context, that's why I try to do that with what the Hawaiian experience was, and so much of this. I mean, when I talk about Killers of the Flower Moon, if there's one part of that book that I find a little disturbing, is that they never even mention the Tulsa riots, which was 50 miles away, or the Tulsa massacre, if you will, the Greenville massacre. So it's hard to say, is there a venue? Like with anything else, when we're trying to play catch up with information, it is really, really difficult, because the ignorance that you talked about is by design. I mean, that stuff is left out intentionally. I mean, so kids are being taught a narrative that's geared and designed to make people proud to be Americans, not to carry any guilt or shame about how they get there. I mean, look at how they characterize dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. I mean, we don't own that, in a way that humanity should own what a terrible crime that was to do that. We try to justify it, and that's what I'm saying. It's really difficult. I mean, I think there's more and more reading material. If there's one thing that the internet does provide, it provides a means to look up resources. The problem the problem is, if you don't know what to look for, if you don't know the name of an event, or the name of a date, or which president was responsible. And one of the things that I've mentioned on the show a couple of times, I plan to write a book that entitled "Run the Gaius," a native perspective on the presidents of the United States, and part of the whole thing is to put it in context. So when people read what our interaction has been from George Washington to Donald Trump. They understand that there has been an interaction, and most of that interaction, including with Barack Obama, has not been good. I mean, there's some window dressing you put on some stuff, but if you don't put any historical context to it, so I mean, if there's any place, any date in history that you find moving, any period, try to search within that time period. What was happening, with Native people, or with any group of people you might be interested in. It's amazing how much correlation there is with what was happening in Europe, what was happening in the South Pacific, and what was happening in South America and North America. It's amazing. Simon Bolivar, the guy who led the Bolivarian Revolution, for independence for many of the countries of South America. He had a kinship with Native people. He had an interaction with Native people. And see, most people can't even put those two things together.
And with that said, John, we have another caller on the line.
All right. Well, I appreciate that last call because that was it was a good point. But it's hard. You're not going to find one-stop shopping. I encourage you to look at some of Howard Zinn's stuff. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who will be joining me after we enter the new year. Dino Giglio Whitaker. There's a number of authors. Vine Deloria. There's a number of people you can go to, but it's hard to find the one-stop shopping, for some of this information. But it's there if you know what to look for. And anybody has a specific question about a time or an era, by all means hit me with it. And if I don't have the information off the top of my head, I'll make sure that I bring it up for the next show. All right, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
My name is Tony from Brooklyn.
Hey, Tony.
And I'd like to thank you for your program. I appreciate so much all the information that you bring forth. I would like to throw in some stuff. I like to say I really feel cheated out of when the colonial system came over here and they did what they did to indigenous people, wiping them out, etc. It leaves me in this date and present time period, even when I was young and growing up, that I don't know what it would have been like if indigenous people had been able to reside and live in their land in peace without people coming over and murdering them and taking over their land. I don't get a chance to know what their life is like, to know what those people had to pass on, what knowledge they had to share with us. And I still don't understand even, I do understand why the colonial people came over and needed to take over the land, and I don't understand why couldn't they just stay in their land and settle all of the differences, because everybody from every point of view, whether it's the Dutch, the Spanish, the English, whatever it is, they all came over with problems from their own land, and they brought over with them all of their problems and they imposed them upon the indigenous people. And then they wiped out the indigenous people, destroyed their culture, etc. So I don't get a chance. I feel cheated out of knowing what they had and had to offer to the world. And also, I'd like to throw out to you, I never really got a chance to know Buffy St. Marie, and seeing her on the film, and Peter Lafarge, and all of these different, I got a little bit of John Trudell, but I don't get to hear their music. In the time period that they existed, I didn't get to really get a chance to hear their music incorporated into that generational time period. So I'm cheated out of it, and I would really like to hear some of it and know some of it because I've been cheated out of it. I appreciate everything that you have to offer, and that's what I have to say.
Well, I appreciate that. On one of the reasons that many people were cheated or deprived of Buffy St. Marie is that she was blacklisted. Pete Seeger and herself and a handful of others, they got blacklisted by the FBI. They created these entire FBI files, and they were literally taken off the radio. So as popular as Buffy St. Marie was in various times, look, she won an Oscar for Up Where We Belong, a song from An Officer and a Gentleman. She's the first Native person to ever win an Oscar for her songwriting. She's a phenomenal talent, but when she started speaking out politically, and being a Native activist, it got her into trouble during that crackdown, and during the Nixon administration, and then after that, there was a big pressure to infiltrate AIM and Black Panthers and shut down alternative voices. So that's why many people have been deprived of her in particular. But you can still find her stuff. She's got a lot of stuff on. I think it's on SoundCloud is where she posts a lot of her stuff. You look her up online. She's got some great stuff, and she's still cranking out some good stuff. She's been in the news recently. So again, I appreciate that. But again. You're right. Many people have been deprived of knowing what would have or could have been. Native people we evolved too. I mean, there's this tendency to think that Native people lived in just one place in history, and that's all we were. That we stopped developing. People lived in the Stone Age. Well, even if we hadn't, created an industrial revolution the way Europeans had, we took our time to develop other skill sets, the studies of the humanities. I mean, Ben Franklin, as much as he used some very racist language in the way he did accounts of Native people, he oftentimes wondered, well, who's more sophisticated? Who's more civilized? When you think about the lives that white people were living, when it was offered, not when it was imposed, but when it was offered to Native people, oftentimes you had Native people saying, your education doesn't serve us. And they would explain it. And that's what he experienced with the Senecas and with some of the other Native people that he interacted with. He said, I got to question whether who's got it right, us or them. And so he, at least as a deeper thinker, for all his own flaws, and he had plenty, but he at least acknowledged that if you could separate yourself from your racial background and really be objective in looking at what the lives of Native people, Indigenous people, the Six Nations in particular is what he's talking about, you would find that everybody has something to offer humanity. But if you just wipe that out, if you wipe out that education, everything from medicine to diet to other survival skills, how you manage your relationship. I mean, it's one of the things that we got into last week when the caller suggested that Native people they had too much land per person and they didn't use it properly. Well, overpopulation is a bit of a problem. And, while he wants to say, well, you look at some of the Native territories, they have all these wide open expanses and their population is down. Of course our population was down. It was eliminated. There was a depopulation effort to eliminate. We had at one point, the total Native population was calculated down as low as 250,000 people from 100 million people. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Look, by all means, I would encourage people to go check out, go look online for the Dakota 38 or the executions at Mankato, Minnesota. You're going to find, that there were some great artist renderings of the thing. They actually used the image of these gallows and these people showing up for this incredible historic event. The idea of executing 38 people at once. They actually have it engraved on spoons for memorabilia, on beer trays, on service trays. I mean, it's amazing how proud the United States was of what they did to those 38 Dakota and Mankato, Minnesota, 157 years ago. Look, I want to thank you guys for listening. I'm not sure if I'm on the schedule for next week or not, but I will be back, and we will have more and more as we go forward. So I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for supporting WBAI. Again, go to the pledge line. Go to 516-620-3602. Make a contribution, and do it in the name of Let's Talk. I appreciate it. Signing off. Reg, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
All righty.